The South African government's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice turned out to become quite a spectacle last year. It was no surprise that the South African government and the ruling ANC that was pushing this was doing this as part of an election strategy to try and rehabilitate its brand back in South Africa by presenting itself as a strongman in the international arena. Now, the government and President Ramaphosa in particular made some very interesting remarks as to why they are pursuing this case, claiming that they have to do this because they have a moral duty to act, that it is a consistent application of international law by the South African government and a consistent condemnation of atrocities. Also, that history will show that the South African government, and by implication the ANC party behind the South African government, was on the right side of history by refusing to shut its eyes to atrocities, and that they were not among those who pretended that they didn't know. Now, I should say from the get-go that this video is not about Israel, Gaza, or the conflict in the Middle East, but it is about the South African government and the ruling ANC's sense of morality against the backdrop of what they said with regard to the Israel case at the International Court of Justice. Now, this case was of course brought to the ICJ in the aftermath of the October 7 attack and the Israeli government's reaction to this. Now again, without trying to analyze what happened in the Middle East and trying to explain the conflict, I will simply resort to the inscription on Britannica in this regard. On October 7, 2023, Hamas led a stunning coordinated attack which took place on Shemini Atzeret, a Jewish holiday that closes the autumn Thanksgiving festival of Sukkot. Many IDF soldiers were on leave, and the IDF's attention had been focused on Israel's northern border rather than the Gaza Strip in the south. The assault began about 6:30 a.m. with a barrage of at least 2,200 rockets launched into Israel in just 20 minutes. During the opening salvo, Hamas used more than half the total number of rockets launched from Gaza during all of the 2021's 11 days conflict. The barrage reportedly overwhelmed the Iron Dome system, the highly successful anti-missile defense system deployed throughout Israel, although the IDF did not specify how many missiles penetrated the system. As the rockets rained down on Israel, at least 1,500 militants from Hamas and the PIJ infiltrated Israel at dozens of points by using explosives and bulldozers to breach the border, which was heavily fortified with smart technology, fencing and concrete. They disabled communication networks for several of the Israeli military ports nearby, allowing them to attack those installations and enter civilian neighborhoods undetected. Militants simultaneously breached the maritime border by motorboat near the coastal town of Zikim. Others crossed into Israel on motorized paragliders. About 1,200 people were killed in the assault, which included families attacked in their homes in kibbutzim and attendees of an outdoor music festival. That number largely comprised Israeli civilians, but also included foreign nationals. A March 2024 United Nations report found evidence that some were victims of sexual violence before they were killed. Adding to the trauma was the fact that it was the deadliest day for the Jews since the Holocaust. More than 240 others were taken into the Gaza Strip as hostages. Many of them were taken from their homes and some from the music festival, including Israelis with dual citizenship. More than half of those taken hostage collectively held passports from about 24 countries, effectively pulling several countries into the efforts to release their citizens. Now, why elaborate on this? Because when discussing the South African government's response to the crisis in the Middle East, it's worthwhile to look at the initial response to the attack on October 7. Ronnie Kasrils has for a long time been one of the major leaders within the ANC. He is a former minister in the South African cabinet and also a prominent leader of the South African Communist Party that is, of course, aligned with the ruling ANC. Speaking at a public event shortly after the 7th of October, this is what he had to say.
The attack, brilliant, spectacular guerrilla warfare attack which will go down in the annals of guerrilla warfare and resistance, along with the Vietnamese and others. They surprised the Israeli Gaza division that has locked them in, that controls the beleaguered Gaza, and has been responsible for killing, murdering, maiming Gaza people in 5 previous all-out wars, where so many children and women died, and you know about all that. They swept on them and they killed them, and damn good, I was so pleased. And people who support resistance applaud it. Absolutely. If we had been able to spring a surprise on the Boers and knock down 100 of them, the people would have been rejoicing to the rooftops. It's a struggle, the armed struggle, and in international law, the occupied people are agreed, it's accepted international law, that they have the right to that kind of resistance.
Now, Ronnie Kasrils has, as far as we know, never been reprimanded publicly by the ANC or the South African government from these comments, and it is highly unlikely that they would do so because what he has expressed in these remarks is aligned with the views of the ANC and the South African government. So based on all of this, what do we know up to now? Number one, that the ANC and the South African government has some sense of morality that they seek to pursue. Number two, that they celebrate what happened on the 7th of October in Israel. And number three, that they wish that they had done this to the Boers, by implication conceding that they had in fact not done this to the Boers, even though they sometimes claim to have done so. But they really wish that they had done this to the Boers. So now let's go to the Israeli retaliation on October 7. At 8:23 a.m. on October 7, the IDF announced a state of alert for war and began mobilizing its army reserves, eventually calling up more than 350,000 reservists over the next several days. 2 hours later, IDF fighter jets began conducting airstrikes in the Gaza Strip. On October 8, Israel declared itself in a state of war, and Netanyahu told residents of the blockaded enclave to get out now. We will be everywhere and with all our might. On October 9, Israel ordered a complete siege of the Gaza Strip, cutting off water, electricity, food and fuel from entering the territory. As Israel conducted airstrikes, international efforts were made to secure the release of the hostages. Qatar, which in years past had coordinated with Israel on the delivery of international aid packages to the Gaza Strip, became a key mediator. But in the first weeks of the war, it managed to negotiate the release of only 4 of the people held by Hamas. Gaza subterranean tunnels, forming an intricate web of passageways extending hundreds of miles, added to the difficulty of locating the hostages as well as targeting militants and their weapon caches. Destroying the tunnels without high civilian cost proved difficult, and conducting military activity inside the tunnels presented a high risk for all those inside, especially for the IDF troops and the hostages who might be held there. Just 3 weeks after Hamas's assault on October 7, more than 1.4 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip had become internally displaced, and with numbers of Palestinians killed still climbing by the thousands, it had already become the deadliest conflict for the Palestinians since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And so, before the South African government became involved, the ANC party that governs South Africa took a stance.
We stand here because we are deeply concerned about the atrocities that are unfolding in the Middle East.
So, let's talk about this sense of morality that the ANC keeps talking about. What does it mean and what does it look like? So very recently, a report was published by the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. by a researcher called Joshua Meservey. And the report is entitled South Africa and the African National Congress's History Supporting Abusive Regimes. The report underlines what the Hudson Institute describes as a selective sense of morality by the South African government. And it goes on to say that but a review of South Africa's foreign policy, namely its voting record at the United Nations, demonstrates that for decades Pretoria and the ANC have remained silent on some of the world's worst abuses and have supported regimes with appalling human rights records. Pretoria's claim that its commitment to human rights forces it to pursue Israel is undercut by South Africa's long record of selective concern on human rights issues not involving Israel and should not be taken seriously by the international community. The report goes on to explain that South Africa's voting record at the United Nations is grossly inconsistent with its claim that it has a moral duty to uphold human rights all over the world, and even more so the claim that they are doing this consistently. These include the Syrian conflict, during which the regime of President Bashar al-Assad is estimated to have killed over 200,000 civilians, including around 15,000 through torture. The conflict also displaced an estimated 14 million Syrians. South Africa abstained on all 22 of the contested resolutions on Syria at the United Nations for which it was eligible to vote, including resolutions condemning the use of chemical weapons after the Assad regime used sarin gas to kill more than 1,400 people in a Damascus suburb. In fact, the report goes on to say South Africa voted in favor of 31 resolutions condemning Israeli actions in the Golan Heights, but none condemning the Assad regime's crimes in Syria. Similarly, of 12 resolutions on Iran's human rights situation on which it could vote, South Africa abstained on 11 and voted against 1. Among these resolutions was a HRC RES 5227, which the United Nations adopted in April 2023 after Iran's morality police beat a woman to death for improper veiling. The killing sparked months-long protests in Iran, which the dictatorship brutally suppressed. Furthermore, South Africa repeated this pattern when voting on resolutions condemning North Korea. South Africa abstained on all 8 motions for which it could have voted, including those that condemned torture, public executions, the existence of a large number of prison camps, and the extensive use of forced labor, all pervasive and severe restrictions on the freedoms of thought, conscience, and religion, mistreatment of and discrimination against disabled children, and the violation of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of women. Another motion condemned the trafficking of women for prostitution or forced marriage, ethnically motivated forced abortions and infanticide, including the police detention centers and labor training camps. Yet another condemned the systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations that in many instances constitute crimes against humanity, violations of the right to life and acts of extermination, murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, and other grave forms of sexual violence and persecution on political, religious, and gender grounds, and the widespread practice of collective punishment with harsh sentences imposed on innocent individuals. Condemning these atrocities evidently does not fall within the scope of the ANC's and the South African government's sense of morality and its so-called consistent application of international law and the so-called consistent condemnation of atrocities. But the report then goes beyond voting records at the United Nations and elaborate on the South African government's relationship with countries such as China, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba, and many others, with regard to which serious questions could be asked about atrocities happening within those countries. And so this leads the author to conclude that the rate at which the South African government abstained on or even voted against draft resolutions condemning some of the worst abuses evidences a pattern of unconcern for human rights that is incongruent with Pretoria's public statement about why it felt compelled to bring the case against Israel. There are also other factors that indicate a very selective approach by the South African government and the ruling ANC when it comes to the condemnation of human rights abuses. The very same government and party that was quick to go to the International Court of Justice was also very quick to threaten to withdraw from the International Criminal Court because it didn't want to abide by orders by this court. In 2015, South Africa ignored its treaty obligations to the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, by hosting then Sudanese dictator Omar al-Bashir, despite an ICC arrest warrant for 3 counts of genocide, among other crimes. That genocide likely killed over 300,000 people and displaced over 2 million. Now, shortly after the October 7 attack, the leadership of the ANC and the South African government hosted a delegation of the leadership of Hamas in South Africa, providing them with opportunities to speak at protest gatherings and so forth. During this visit, Hamas leader Khaled Mashal was invited to speak at a rally organized by the ANC, where he is reported to have announced that attacks such as the one on October 7 would continue. In fact, the ANC has a lasting relationship with Hamas that have also visited South Africa back in 2015. Now, these are just some examples indicative of a very distorted sense of morality by the ANC and the South African government, elaborated on in this report. But I should add that this is not just an international phenomenon, that the ANC's distorted sense of morality is also very evident with regard to which it is responding to crises within South Africa, of which there are way too many to mention in this video. But we will, for the sake of the argument, look at farm murders and the ANC's response to farm murders. One would argue that it's not possible to deny the existence of this phenomenon, partly due to the fact that many leaders within the ANC and the South African government have suggested that the problem is not quite as bad as some people would argue, or even worse, have suggested that the problem does indeed exist, but it ought to be blamed on the victims. President Ramaphosa, however, went onto an international platform in 2018 and publicly denied the existence of the problem.
But on the tweet itself, he was clearly misinformed. And whoever gave him that information was completely wrong. There are no killings of farmers or white farmers in South Africa.
Several years ago, Julius Malema, the leader of the EFF, said at a political rally that he intends to slit the throat of whiteness. Just several days after this, Ramaphosa publicly called on Malema to rejoin the ANC, saying that he can see that Malema is still ANC deep down in his heart. In 2018, when the ANC and the EFF managed to pass a motion in Parliament in South Africa that the state had to be empowered to confiscate private property without compensation, Ramaphosa announced that confiscating private property would create the Garden of Eden and the ultimate paradise in South Africa. Former Deputy President David Mabuza went even further, saying that if white people in South Africa do not voluntarily hand over their property, there would be a violent takeover. And Minister in the Cabinet Zweli Mkhize went as far as saying that black people in South Africa can rest assured that once the South African government starts confiscating private property, they would only confiscate property belonging to white people. Now, in case you had forgotten, this video is about the ANC claiming that it has a very strong sense of morality and that it is acting consistently in the application of this sense of morality. But again, there are many more examples. But for now, I want to turn to this court case in the International Court of Justice and some of the arguments that were presented by the South African government and compare them to some of the arguments that have been made by either representatives of the South African government or of the ruling party within South Africa and with regard to particular issues in South Africa. But even more than that, not just arguments made by the ANC and so forth, arguments made by the exact same lawyers who were representing the South African government at the ICJ. Now, I should say that having been involved with a variety of hate speech cases within South Africa, some of which were against the ANC itself, it really is quite bizarre to watch some of the arguments presented at the ICJ case from that perspective.
Alliance, shoot to kill, Gamaza, kill the poor, the farmer, kill the poor, the farmer. Brr, pa, pa, Attention! Kichi, kichi, kichi. Secret control. Alliance. Shoot to kill. Master. Shoot to kill. Kill 'em. Kill the poor. The farmer. Kill the poor. The farmer.
The same party and the same advocate that has argued in court that a chant such as kill the boer, kill the farmer, shoot to kill a man is within the ambit of freedom of expression, and that there is nothing wrong when political leaders chant this, argued in the International Court of Justice that Israel has genocidal intent. And they argue this, among others, based on songs chanted by Israeli soldiers. And so in this regard, we need to shine the spotlight on the astounding double standards of advocate Thembeka Ngcukaitobi, who represented South Africa at the ICJ, but who has also represented Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters in the Supreme Court of Appeals in South Africa, in AfriForum's case against Malema for his chanting of kill the Boer. And in this case, he argued that it's perfectly acceptable for a highly influential political leader to go to a political rally to lead his crowd into chanting kill the Boer, kill the farmer, shoot to kill a man, because doing so, as this advocate has argued, falls within the ambit of freedom of expression, and that the context and the anger of the person expressing these words had to be considered, and that it's merely an expression of his political style. He went on to say, if words offend you, you must live with it, because that is the price for freedom of expression. Then he goes to the ICJ and argues that Israel has genocidal intent based on songs chanted by soldiers.
The Prime Minister's invocation of Amalek is being used by soldiers to justify the killing of civilians, including children. These are the soldiers repeating the inciting words of their Prime Minister. Israeli soldiers in Gaza were filmed dancing, chanting, and singing in November.
Now, I should say that obviously this is a complicated case and that I'm not discussing all the details of this case, which is why I've added the links to the entire video of the case so that you can watch the whole case. I'm only highlighting certain sections of the argument in this case. So before we get to the Kill the Boer case, let's have a look at some of the arguments that were presented at the ICJ. Thembeka Ngcukaitobi argued that Israel has genocidal intent based on utterances made by influential politicians, which was then repeated by their followers.
There is an extraordinary feature in this case, that Israel's political leaders, military commanders, and persons holding official positions have systematically and in explicit terms declared their genocidal intent. And these statements are then repeated by soldiers on the ground in Gaza as they engage in the destruction of Palestinians and the physical infrastructure of Gaza.
He went on to say that statements like these are not open to reinterpretation, and that if the statements were not intended, they would not have been made.
These are orders to destroy and to maim what cannot be destroyed. These statements are not open to neutral interpretations or after-the-fact rationalizations and reinterpretations by Israel. The statements were made by persons in command of the state. They communicated state policy. It is simple. If the statements were not intended, they would not have been made.
He argued that this is genocidal speech and that the government's failure to condemn this has served to normalize genocidal rhetoric and that this is unacceptable.
This failure to prevent, condemn, and punish such speech by the government has served to normalize genocidal rhetoric and extreme danger for Palestinians within Israeli society.
He then went on to say that we should not believe them when they say that they did not actually mean the words as they were framed in this chant and that the words speak for themselves.
In conclusion, Madam President, many propagators of grave atrocities have protested that they were misunderstood, that they did not mean what they said, and that their own words were taken out of context. What state would admit to a genocidal intent? Any suggestion that Israeli officials did not mean what they said or were not fully understood by soldiers and civilians alike to mean what they said should be rejected by this court.
This is because, in his analysis, the context within which these words were uttered should not be considered or is irrelevant. He goes on to frame his argument as to why there is genocidal intent by saying that these utterances were not just issued by ordinary people, but by senior political leaders who are very influential, and that this also has to be considered by the court. Now let's go to the Kill the Boer case, which happened just a few months before the ICJ case. In this case, the very same advocate Tembe Kaitobi, arguing on behalf of the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and Julius Malema, said that if you are offended, shocked, or disturbed, you must live with it, because that is the price for freedom of expression.
So if you are offended, you are shocked, and you are disturbed, you must live with it, because that's the price we pay for freedom of expression.
He said that when they, political leaders such as Malema, merely express their opinion in words that are unapologetic, they should not be patronized by telling them what they are allowed to say and what they ought not to say.
That when blacks speak out against racism, and they do so in words that are unapologetic, they should not be patronized and told about rationality and speaking softly.
He says that calling out racism must be done in unapologetic terms and that we must not put patronizing cautions on people who are responding to atrocities. Then he goes on to say that the speech, again in this case the chant "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer, shoot to kill a man," is intended to destabilize the economic consensus. He said it can be shocking, disturbing, offensive, but it is perfectly lawful.
The nature of the political speech that is intended to destabilize the economic consensus that still lives right at the top can be shocking, it can be disturbing, it can be offensive, but it's perfectly lawful.
He goes on to say that the word Boer is not a referral to an ethnic group or a particular racial group, but that it is merely referring to a system. And when you chant about killing Boers and killing farmers, you are simply saying that there was a particular atrocity that was committed to which you are responding, and in your response you are calling for the system to be dismantled. And so talking about killing Boers and farmers should only be seen as a figurative expression to shine a spotlight on injustice.
The words as construed by the court objectively are not a referral to a race or to any ethnicity. They are a referral to a system of racial dispossession and oppression. And he made it clear that when he uses farmer or Boer, he doesn't do so in ethnic or racial terms. He is doing so figuratively to shine a spotlight on land injustice which Africans continue to experience.
And now we should add that while all of these so-called figurative expressions are happening, the context remains that farmers are actually being killed, and that research has been provided that after high-profile cases of hate speech towards farmers, and white farmers in particular, there tends to be an upsurge in attacks and murders of these farmers. But according to advocate Nlukai Toby, the EFF and Julius Malema, this ought not to be considered. And so he goes on to say that once we consider the context that violent action led to this expression, it is wholly improper to say that a song ought to be banned.
Once the context is explained, it becomes wholly improper to then say, in the face of white supremacy that is displaying itself through violent action by white people, a song, nevertheless should be banned.
That this is an employment of freedom of speech in a dramatic, adversarial and inflammatory way to draw attention to a political problem and to encourage people to participate in solving the problem. It is just his brand of rhetoric, purely political speech, he goes on to argue, and that the context has to be considered.
What Mr. Malema was doing was to employ a figure of speech in a dramatic, adversarial and inflammatory way. And he was doing so to draw attention to a political problem and to his brand of politics. And when all is said and done, Mr. Malema's political rhetoric is pure political speech. It's not racialized or ethnicized speech. And for that reason, these words, understood in context through the prism of a reasonable, well-informed South Africans, are not based on race or ethnicity. They are based purely on politics.
This is just political speech by a grandstanding politician that wants to draw attention to what they stand for. No one in their right mind believes that there is an actual calling for the killing of farmers.
They are just political speech by a grandstanding politician, or political speech by a politician that wants to draw attention to what they stand for. And no one in their right mind believes that there is an actual calling for the killing of whites or actual calling for the killing of farmers.
Now, I should mention that you would see in these videos that this particular advocate keeps referring to black people, atrocities committed against black people, and the fact that people expressing these words are black. And this is not just incidental. This is because within South Africa, the South African Human Rights Commission has published a ruling on Julius Malema after he was charged with hate speech for saying that he is not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now.
We are not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now. That means at some future date, we may call for the slaughter of white people. Is that correct?
Let's deal with that at that future date. I don't know what's going to happen.
So you're saying you are not ruling out that in the future you may very well call for the slaughter of white people?
It may not be me.
Could it be you?
It could be me, yes, but it may not be me.
Yes, so it could be you. You could, at some future date, call for the slaughter of white people.
What will necessitate that?
You tell me.
I don't know. Why would I do that?
You've said you could do it in the future, is that correct?
I can't guarantee that I can't do it or I won't do it.
So right now,
so I'm not ruling out that possibility.
If I asked you to pledge, to say, I will never call for the slaughter of white people, would you make that pledge?
I will do it with ease.
Make that pledge.
Why would I do that?
I'm asking you to make that pledge.
I
will do it.
I won't do it.
Make the pledge.
I won't do it.
You won't do it?
Yes.
I understand.
The Human Rights Commission has declared that we need to remember that Julius Malema is black, and the fact that he is black is an important factor to be considered by the court. That the race of the person who is being accused should be considered, and as a result of the fact that he is black, he did not commit hate speech. Where does all of this leave us? It's very clear that if the ANC and the South African government has a sense of morality, it is a very distorted sense of morality. And if there is some claim of consistency in the condemnation of atrocities and in the application of international law, it is a bizarre claim, to say the least. But we can make the case that the ANC and the South African government are in fact very consistent in their approach to these issues. And this is because they have a double standard and that they are applying their double standard consistently. It is a double standard in which they seek to strengthen and support any institution or organization that is deemed to be leftist or progressive and that could be regarded as waging some form of a war or an assault on traditional Western values, while trying to protect those or ignore the atrocities committed by those who are waging this war.